Welcome to Unbelievable Stories. Today's story is full of shocking twists and real drama. Subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's dive in.
Tonight, we are celebrating John Mitchell, my friend and partner, as Banker of the Year. Andrew Harrison kicked off the event with applause filling the room at the Seaside Retreat Ballroom. At the head table, near the podium, David sat trying to appear both modest and pleased. Truthfully, he'd rather be anywhere else. Being in the spotlight made him uneasy, though he couldn't deny it felt good to be recognized for the dream he had worked so hard to achieve. At least it's good publicity for Hillside Savings, he thought. Hillside Savings Bank was an idea David had shaped since college, focusing on helping everyday people rather than competing for big corporate clients. Investing in people was the bank's slogan. Many people had told him that retail banking was dead. In fact, when he'd submitted his idea in the form of a paper for his banking and finance course in college, the professor had given him a failing grade because your idea will never work. Even Andrew Harrison, the finance major who had become his friend, had doubts. Basically, everyone hated his plan except the people in the community who were his target customers. In an age of impersonality, they loved the personal service David offered. They took advantage of his small business loans and personal lines of credit and repaid his faith with a remarkably low default rate. The result had been that David's bank, which he had idealistically named Hillside Savings Bank, turned a profit well ahead of its forecast, growing at a rate that had amazed industry analysts. Now the word was that it was only a matter of time before one of the big boys came knocking with an offer to acquire the bank. Such a buyout would have been extremely lucrative for David, but he had no interest in selling out because he believed so strongly in what he was doing. As Charlie's speech droned on, David's wife, Emily, slipped back into her seat beside him and handed him a cup of coffee. David smiled and gave her a quick kiss in gratitude. His addiction to caffeine was almost his trademark. He was never without a cup or mug in front of him. Of course, it hasn't always been easy for David, Charlie continued from the podium. Hearing Charlie's words, David thought somberly, they don't know the half of it. Growing up, John Mitchell made three major decisions about his life. Teenagers frequently make such decisions, but unlike most, David actually kept his. His first big decision was to avoid alcohol in all forms. The reason for this was simple: his mother was an alcoholic. While David was still in grammar school, she had managed to function fairly well. She wouldn't start drinking until dinner, then she kept going until she'd fall asleep, and David's father would carry her off to bed. Gradually, though, drinks with dinner grew into cocktails over lunch. Once that became the norm, David quickly learned to avoid her as much as possible in the afternoons. He'd never forgotten the time he hadn't eaten all the soup she prepared for lunch, and she drunkenly threw the rest of it in his face. David's father was not oblivious to the problem and had tried repeatedly to change the course of his wife's downward spiral. He'd taken her liquor bottles and poured the contents down the drain. She simply became more resourceful at hiding her booze. He'd taken her spending money away. She replaced it with grocery money. When interventions and counseling sessions failed, David's father was forced to accept the truth: he couldn't save his wife unless she helped, but she adamantly refused to admit she had a problem. So, David's father shifted his attention to his son, focusing on protecting him as much as possible from the side effects of his mother's illness. Although he had a promising career at the bank where he worked, David's father turned down several promotions to remain at the branch near their home. He wanted to be close to his son in case he was needed. There had been several occasions when David's mother had forgotten to pick him up from school. Later, when her driving became problematic, David's father sold her car, and David began riding the school bus. His father's precautions paid off the day David came home from middle school to find the front door wide open and the house empty. Tearfully, he had called his father, who rushed home to be with his son. After a futile search of the area, his father called the police. It was 2 days before they found her sleeping in a homeless shelter downtown. Even worse, she refused to come home, a decision that hurt both father and son, though in different ways. David's mother never did return home. A year later, police found her unconscious under a bridge. By then, David's father had divorced her for abandonment, but she was still David's mother. So, father and son went to see her in the charity ward, where she was being treated. David would never forget what a person dying from cirrhosis of the liver looked like, and he swore never to touch alcohol as long as he lived. Instead, coffee became his drink of choice, and he was seldom seen without a mug in front of him. David's second major decision had been to become a banker like his father. His dad had always been a major influence, and as his mother began to withdraw from David's life, his father became even more important. So it was little surprise that David decided to be like his dad when he grew up. But the path to get there had not been straightforward. During his teenage years, John Mitchell rebelled against his father, like so many young adults do. It was during David's first year in college that things came to a head. David was attending the local branch of Northridge University and living at home to save money. His dad expected David to follow the same rules he had during senior year in high school, and David resented the lack of freedom. Having lost his wife, David's father, not surprisingly, was overprotective of his son. After a semester filled with tension, the conflict came to a head during the holidays. Already chafing under his father's restrictions, David's feelings intensified when news of a banking scandal hit the papers. That was all the idealistic young man needed to decide that his father was part of a banker's plot to oppress the nation's poor. To dramatize his disdain, David boldly declared that he would not observe any holiday festivities because the season was just a capitalist conspiracy between retailers and bankers that took advantage of the gullibility of the poor. Instead of arguing, David's father ordered his son into the car on Thanksgiving Day and drove him through one of the poorer sections of Maplewood, the town where they lived. He slowed down and pointed toward a small home on one side of the street. "See that home? I arranged the loan that helped the owner to buy that house," he told his son. "But it's a crummy little house in a terrible neighborhood," David exclaimed. "Maybe so," his father acknowledged, "but it's his home, and he works hard to keep it up. More importantly, he's building equity, which means that, with any luck, he'll get the money he's put into it back and make a little profit to boot. Isn't that worth something to him?" Twisting and turning through the streets of the neighborhood, his dad took David by a home with a 5-year-old car sitting in the driveway. "I helped loan the woman who lives there enough to buy that car," he told David proudly. "So she bought a used car, so what?" "That just means she has a car note to pay along with all her other bills," David sniped. His father nodded gravely. "That's right, David, but buying that car meant that she could get a better job across town, and that meant more money for her family. And here's another thing, if she had financed her car through the dealer instead of with our bank, she'd probably be paying significantly more each month." At the next house they passed, a large tow truck sat in the driveway. "Our bank loaned him the money to buy that truck several years ago. Now, he has his own towing business, and since he got on with AAA, he's making a good living for his family. Sure, the bank charges interest on the loan, but I don't think we're exploiting him. That loan means that he's got a chance to make something of himself." After he pointed out several similar examples, David's father turned their car back toward their home. "Banking and lending are like anything else, they can do good or harm," he told his son. "But done fairly and honestly, banking is a lever that can help people do more than they thought was possible." David said nothing on the ride back, but it was clear to his father that his son was thinking about what he'd seen. Sure enough, the next semester, David switched his major to business and began taking courses in banking and finance. Later, he would tell people that the ride on New Year's Day had been the thing that helped him commit to that path. That same excursion also helped change David's perspective on his father. Before, he'd seen his dad as an inflexible parental figure who didn't understand his son's needs. But hearing his father's enthusiasm for his work gave David a new insight into his father's personality. At first, David merely asked his father questions about banking and his work at the office. After a while, he began to seek his dad's opinions on a variety of subjects. Finally, he dared to ask about his mother, and he learned about his dad's carefully concealed pain and the shame he felt in not being able to save his wife from her addiction. This new closeness between father and son was something David cherished, and he was even more grateful when, during David's junior year in university, his father had a massive heart attack and passed away. David's sense of loss was at least partially mitigated by the closeness he'd developed with his father in the last year of his life. After the funeral, David found he had even more reason to be grateful to his father when he learned that he was the beneficiary of a substantial life insurance policy. There was enough money to allow David to finish college and start his career with a nice nest egg left over. Many young men would have been tempted to travel the world and enjoy life to the fullest before settling down to work. David had other plans. The nest egg his father had provided became the seed money to fund David's dream of starting his own bank. It also enabled David to pursue the third decision he'd made. David had made that decision back in his sophomore year of senior year in high school. He had signed up for a community service project at his school, and on the day the group of student volunteers met for the first time, he saw Chloe Peterson. Afterward, he couldn't say exactly what had happened, but he was so overwhelmed by the sight of her that he didn't hear the sponsor of the group call on him. The other kids laughed, and Lily turned to look at him as well. David blushed furiously and looked down at the sign-up sheet in front of him. When he finally dared to look up, he found Lily still looking at him with a strange expression on her face. After the meeting, David was still embarrassed, but before he could escape, Lily was suddenly standing in front of him. "Why were you staring at me like that?" she demanded. Confronted by this vision of the opposite sex, David's mind lost all capacity for rational thought. To his horror, he heard himself blurt out, "I was thinking that you were the girl I want to marry someday." Then, he clapped his hand over his mouth as though trying to stop his words before they could escape and humiliate him even more. Lily looked at him in shock and said, "That is so funny." David wanted to die on the spot, but something in Lily's tone of voice made him pause and listen. She looked at him very solemnly. "I was thinking the same thing about you." From that day on, the two of them were a couple. At first, their romance was the source of much amusement among their classmates, but the two of them were oblivious to everything except each other. After a while, it was simply an accepted fact that David and Lily were together and would always be so. When David's father learned about their relationship, he was concerned. "I'd much prefer you date a variety of girls in your class," he told his son. "That way, you'll learn more about them and about yourself." David didn't even bother to argue. His decision had already been made. As David's father came to know Lily, however, he felt much more comfortable with his son's choice. The girl had a sweet temper, was well-behaved, and consistently earned a place on the honor roll in school. And he had to admit, she was certainly attractive. She was tall and slim. In fact, when they first met, she was an inch or two taller than David because she'd gotten her growth spurt early. She had light brown hair that hung down to her shoulders and framed her pretty face perfectly. "She's the all-American girl," David's father thought admiringly. Seeing how strongly David and Lily felt about each other, David's father took his son aside and tried to give him the lecture on responsible sex. After hemming and hawing around the subject, he finally said, "What I'm trying to say is that neither of you wants any babies just now." David just grinned and put the man out of his misery. "It's all right, Dad. You don't have to worry. Lily wants to wait to have sex until we are married, and I've promised her I will." His father left the conversation mightily relieved that it was over and even more impressed with his son's girlfriend. "I just wonder if they'll be able to keep that promise," he thought, remembering how he'd felt when he was a teenager. Against all odds, the two young people managed to do so all the way through senior year in high school. That's not to say that they remained perfectly chaste. Inevitably, they'd managed to graduate from first base to second and then on to third. Nevertheless, on many nights, David had gone home from a date with blue balls, but he loved Lily so much that he was willing to bear the discomfort for her sake. There had never been any question that the two of them would go to the same college, and with their excellent grades, there was little doubt of their both getting accepted. By that time, they'd been dating so long that both their families felt perfectly comfortable with the two of them going off together. Even their plans to move in together after their sophomore year caused no alarm. The master plan had long since been set. The two would marry immediately upon graduation. But as they say, men plan, and the gods laugh. The sudden death of David's father changed everything. David dropped out of school for a semester, moved back home to deal with the funeral, handle his father's estate, and grieve for the person whose importance in his life was rivaled only by Lily. She had wanted to drop out as well to help David, but he wouldn't hear of it. "There's nothing you can do. This is my responsibility, and I intend to spend all my time doing what needs to be done so I can return to college next semester. You stay in school and graduate on time," he told her. Reluctantly, she did so. As the weeks passed, Lily's friends on campus urged her to get out and enjoy herself a little. After a while, she did, believing that David wouldn't want her to become a recluse. When she started to appear at parties and campus activities, it didn't take long for some of the men to hit on her. To every invitation, she was unfailingly polite and unbending. She was David's and she would wait for him. For David's part, he avoided socializing at all. His grief obviated any desire for parties, and when he could manage it, he drove over to the college to be with Lily. It was during one of these visits that things changed. The loss of a parent is a big blow at any time, and a sudden, early loss is even harder to cope with. On an intellectual level, David knew this, so he was not surprised at how depressed he felt. What he had not expected was how subdued Lily became. Both of them had missed each other terribly, but David had expected Lily to be excited to see him. Instead, she was reserved and quiet. They had gone out to dinner together, but instead of going out dancing afterward, David had taken her back to the one-room apartment she rented. They sat down on the sofa together, and David held her by the shoulders so he could look into her face. "What is it, babe? I know all this has been almost as hard on you as it's been on me, but is there something else that's bothering you? It's okay, you can always tell me." She looked at him, and tears began to well up in her eyes, frightening David. "Your dad's death was such a shock to me," she said quietly. "He was a wonderful man, and he was so sweet to me." With that, she began to cry so hard that she couldn't continue to speak. David's eyes were leaking, too, but he still couldn't understand what Lily was trying to say. She blew her nose on a tissue and then tried to get control of herself. "It was so sudden, and it scared me," she went on. "It scared me because I started thinking, what if it had been one of us?" "Oh, Lily, no. Don't think about things like that. We are both young and healthy." "There's no need to worry," David said, trying to reassure her. "But something could happen," she said stubbornly. "And I couldn't help thinking about it. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually." David saw a look of determination cross her face, and she took a deep breath. "Anyway, I've decided. I don't want to wait anymore. I want you to make love to me right now." With that, she suddenly threw herself at David, straddling him and kissing him frantically. David was caught completely off guard. His mind raced to process what was happening. "But I promised," he said, trying to hold her off, but his resolve was weak. "Forget the promise," she growled. "I want you now." Later, when their breathing returned to normal, David lifted himself up enough to look at Lily's face. To his shock, she was crying again. "Did I hurt you?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Oh no," she said quickly. I'm just so happy. Now, no matter what happens, we made love to each other." David laughed with relief and crushed her to him in his own happiness. However, as the reality of what they had done settled in, their thoughts turned to the practical. They realized they hadn't used any protection. The following weeks were filled with anxiety until Lily's period finally came. From that point on, they agreed they would always use protection, though it didn't diminish their closeness. Even though David had only been away from college for one semester, he found it difficult to catch up. Not only was he out of practice at studying, but many of the courses he needed weren't offered during the second semester. He wound up attending summer school. When he saw how well that worked, he decided to continue with summer courses the next year, allowing him to catch up with Lily and graduate alongside her. They were married in the campus chapel 3 days after graduation. As David kissed his beautiful bride, he whispered in her ear, "Remember that day back in senior year in high school? Best decision I ever made." Before launching his own bank, David decided to gain practical experience in the banking industry. His grades, along with his father's connections, helped him land a position as a management trainee at Pioneer National Bank in Everett City. David dove into the job eagerly, soaking up as much knowledge as possible. His enthusiasm helped him tolerate the drudgery of the entry-level position, but deep down, he was impatient to start his own bank. Lily, who had majored in education, secured a teaching position at Willow Creek Elementary School. Though the school was in a lower-income area, her patience and loving personality quickly won over her students. Together, David and Lily earned just enough to get by without dipping into the nest egg David had inherited. He offered to invest some of the money in a down payment on a house, but Lily insisted they save it for starting his bank. "We'll have plenty of time to buy a house when your bank is a big success," she told him. Married life had its challenges, but it was also filled with joy. One challenge, though, was Lily's aversion to doctors. She was a bit of a hypochondriac but feared going to the doctor in case they found something wrong. The first time she was due for a gynecological checkup after their marriage, David came home from work to find her in a funk about the upcoming exam. Quickly grasping the situation, David pulled her into the bedroom and affected a ridiculous German accent. "Ah, little girl, you have come to me for your exam. Very well, lie back on my examining table, and we shall see what we shall see." In spite of herself, Lily giggled and lay back on the bed, playing along. "V, he intoned solemnly, everything looks good from here." David rose up and smiled at his beautiful bride. "I hope your exam tomorrow won't go anything like that," he teased. Lily smiled. "Since my OBGYN is a woman, I think we can be sure of that." David went off to work the next day, satisfied that he had managed to lighten Lily's mood. He was shocked, however, when he came home that evening to find her in tears. "She told me she found something that didn't look right," Lily sobbed. "She wants me to see a specialist right away." Fear stabbed at David, but he tried to hide it as he took Lily in his arms. "It'll be all right," he told her. "Doctors always are on the side of caution. It's probably nothing at all." But it wasn't nothing. A grim-faced doctor delivered the stunning news: Lily had ovarian cancer. Further testing revealed that Lily carried the BRCA1 genetic mutation, which predisposed her to the disease. She had never been tested before, and there was no history of cancer in her immediate family. "We want to schedule surgery early next week," the doctor told them. "We need to be aggressive and get this before it spreads." Lily buried her face in David's chest as he asked the dreaded question. "What does the surgery involve?" The doctor looked at him sympathetically. "We won't know for sure until we begin, but if all goes well, we'll only need to remove the ovaries." David felt Lily stiffen against him. They both wanted children, and the thought of losing that possibility crushed them. As the day of Lily's surgery approached, David was surprised by her reaction. While fear haunted his waking and sleeping hours, she exhibited a sense of calm. David felt he couldn't ask her directly, but she sensed his unspoken question and tried to explain. "I've always been afraid of the unknown, especially when it comes to doctors," she told him. "But now that the worst has happened, there's nothing left to fear." The surgery went well, and the oncologist reassured David afterward, "I think we got it all. With any luck, Lily should live cancer-free for the rest of her life." Unfortunately, luck seemed to have abandoned them. During follow-up testing a few months later, the results were devastating: the cancer had spread to Lily's liver. The doctors started her on a course of chemotherapy, which made her horribly ill but had little effect on the cancer. The disease continued to spread, and Lily's life became a cycle of treatment, illness, and bed rest. David's life devolved into a nightmare of keeping up appearances at work, providing care for Lily, and maintaining their home. Amelia had just finished her latest course of chemotherapy when the oncologist came with bad news. "The treatment isn't working as we'd hoped." David held Lily's hand tightly, feeling lost. The doctor offered another option. "There's a clinical trial at Stanford Medical Center that's had some promising results. I think you'd be a good candidate, Lily. Would you like to try it?" "No," she said, her voice firm. David and the doctor were both startled. "Are you sure?" David asked, barely able to get the words out. "This could be your chance." Lily shook her head. "I don't want to go through that anymore. No more hospitals, no more treatments. I just want to go home." Tears filled David's eyes as he saw her resolve. He realized this was the end, and his heart shattered. The hospice nurse, a kind older woman, visited frequently. She helped David care for Lily at home, providing the guidance and support he needed during the hardest days. Lily spent her final weeks in bed, growing weaker with each passing day, but she remained peaceful, even as her body faded away. One afternoon, as David sat by her side, the nurse called him into the kitchen. "It's almost time, David. You should be with her." When David returned to the bedroom, Lily was lying in bed, her hair spread out on the pillow like a halo. Her breathing was shallow, but when she saw David, she smiled weakly. "Come here, my darling," she whispered. David sat beside her, taking her frail hand in his. He could feel how little strength was left in her body. "You've been the best husband I could ever have," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm so happy we found each other. I wouldn't change a thing." "Oh, Lily," David cried. You're my dream, my perfect other half. How am I going to live without you? Lily smiled, then grew serious. That's what I want to talk to you about, David. I want you to promise me 2 things. Anything, babe. Anything, he choked out, his tears falling freely. First, promise me you'll follow your dream and start your bank. You've always believed in it. Promise me you'll do it for me. I promise, he managed to say. The second thing, she continued, is that I want you to find someone else. Someone who will love you and take care of you when I can't anymore. David pulled back, horrified. Don't make me say that. I could never, there will never be. Yes, there will, she interrupted, her voice stronger now. You'll find her someday. And when you do, I want you to give her all the love you've given me. David cried harder, shaking his head. No, I can't, Lily. Promise me, she demanded. All right, he whispered. I promise. With that, David laid his head beside her arm, still holding her hand in his, trying to regain control. After a minute, he was startled by a touch on his shoulder. The hospice nurse was standing beside him. She's at peace now, the nurse said softly. Say your goodbyes and then give me a little time to get her ready. He realized then that the hand he was holding had grown cold. David bent over and kissed Lily Thomas for the last time, then forced himself to his feet and shuffled out of the room into the next phase of his life, the one without her. Later, David would say the only thing that kept him sane during that time was his determination to start his own bank. Within days after Lily's funeral, he quit his job and began laying the groundwork for the new bank he had dreamed about for so long. Driven by his promise to her, he intended to get started as quickly as possible. His first task was to call Lucas Edwards, an old college friend. In their college years, the two had discussed David's plans many times. Although Greg hadn't shared the same vision, he had faith in David's passion. Using the money from David's inheritance, they set out to start the new bank. Their first challenge was to choose a name. Greg jokingly suggested they call it the 111th National Bank, since so many other numbers had already been taken. But David wanted something that set them apart, something that reflected their mission. If we are starting a bank to help the community, let's call it Community Plus Bank, Greg proposed. I like that, David replied, but we need to focus on people in our community, so let's call it People's First Bank. And with that, People's First Bank was born. Everything about People's First Bank was unconventional. While larger banks were transitioning quickly to electronic banking, David focused on opening small branches in working-class neighborhoods. Instead of grand buildings, People's First branches were located in leased spaces, often abandoned gas stations or closed-down fast food joints, keeping costs low. The rents were dirt cheap, there was always plenty of parking, and through clever design and economical materials, David renovated the properties inexpensively. David's bank competed not just with traditional banks but also with payday lenders and car title loan companies. People's First Bank offered many of the same services but without the predatory rates that exploited the working poor. Slowly, word spread that David's bank was fair and honest, and his customer base grew. His initial return on assets was modest, but David was prepared to be patient. Following the examples set by his father, David focused on small loans that helped people maintain employment or start new businesses. Roofers borrowed to cover the cost of shingles, landscapers bought shrubbery and supplies, and dry cleaners came to David when their equipment needed repairs. The business grew steadily, and while there were setbacks along the way, 5 years into operation, People's First Bank was turning a small but steady profit. By then, David felt secure enough to buy a house. The one he chose was far too large for a single man, but it was the kind of home he had once envisioned buying for Lily. As time passed, David's pain from losing her slowly subsided, but he still could not bring himself to seriously consider the other promise he had made, to find someone else. A year after Lily's passing, David's friends began encouraging him to socialize again. Lucas's wife, Natalie, took it upon herself to find suitable matches for David, but despite going on dates with some very nice women, none stirred his interest. It wasn't until 4 years after launching People's First Bank that everything changed. Rather than renting an expensive office for himself, David made it a practice to work in his branch banks, rotating locations each week. He believed it kept him in closer touch with both employees and customers. One afternoon, while he was reviewing figures at the branch on Pine Lane, the silent alarm triggered. David glanced at the security cameras and spotted a man leaning against the teller's window, clearly attempting to rob the bank. He switched the view to check for any accomplices and saw none. The only vehicle in the parking lot was a beat-up old Honda Ridgeline. Quickly, David made a decision. The teller, following protocol, filled a bag with cash and handed it to the man, who snatched it from her and dashed out the door. As the man ran toward the pickup truck, he yanked open the door, only to find David sitting calmly in the passenger seat. "Who the hell are you?" the man asked, shocked. "I'm John Mitchell." "That's my bank you're trying to rob," David replied. The man thrust his hand into his jacket pocket, attempting to appear menacing. "Get out of my truck, or else," he shouted. David remained calm. "Not until you hear what I have to say." The man looked confused but didn't budge. "I'm telling you, you better get out now, before something bad happens," he yelled again, but his voice was less certain this time. "You don't have a gun, do you?" David asked. The man slumped in defeat. "No," he admitted. David pointed to the bag the man was holding. "How much were you hoping to get from this?" The man looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. "I was hoping for $35,000. Figured it'd be enough to catch up on the mortgage and pay the bills till I can find work again." David shook his head. "There's less than $7,500 in that bag. That's the limit we allow in each teller window." The man's shoulders sagged further. "Some bank robber I turned out to be," he muttered bitterly. David studied him for a moment, then opened the passenger door. "Come with me." The man followed him back into the bank, where the employees were in shock to see their boss walk in with the would-be robber. They were even more stunned when David set the man down at a desk and asked for a loan application. "Okay," David said, "here's the deal. You give me back the money you tried to take, and in return, I'll lend you what you need. You can pay me back when you get back on your feet." The man was stunned. "Why would you do that?" "I just tried to rob your bank, and I don't even have a job." David smiled as he filled out the loan form. "If I call the police and report a robbery, we'll be shut down for the rest of the day, maybe longer. That's a loss I don't want to deal with. But if I lend you the money and you repay it, we'll both come out ahead." The man stared at the loan application in disbelief. "Wait, you're loaning me $35,000? I only needed $18,000. David shrugged. "I figured you might need a little extra cushion. If you don't, you can always give it back." The man's eyes filled with tears as he took the pen David handed him. "God bless you, Mr. Saunders." The story of the would-be robber spread like wildfire through the bank, and by that afternoon, Greg was on the phone with David. "What were you thinking?" Greg demanded. "We'll never see that money again." "Maybe, maybe not," David replied. "But it felt like the right thing to do." The story didn't end there. Another customer at the bank had recorded the entire incident on their phone and posted it on social media. By the next day, the video had gone viral. Local news outlets picked it up, and before David knew it, reporters were calling for interviews. The story became national news, and the next thing David knew, he was being asked to fly to New York to appear on Good Morning America. During the live interview, the host surprised David with the news that a local employer had offered the would-be robber a job. "If John Mitchell can take a chance on him, so can we," the company representative said to cheers from the audience. The publicity gave People's First Bank a huge boost. New customers poured in, impressed by David's compassionate approach to business. Even Greg, who had been skeptical, had to admit that the gamble had paid off. Several months later, when the media attention had finally died down, one of David's employees approached him with an unusual request. "There's a woman here asking to see you. She says she's a reporter." David groaned. "I thought we were done with all that. Can't she come back another time?" The employee hesitated. "I really think you should see her." David frowned but agreed. When the door opened, he looked up and found himself staring. The woman standing before him was breathtaking. She was tall, with dark hair that framed her striking face. Though her nose had a slight bend, suggesting it had once been broken, it only made her look more distinctive. David quickly stood and shook her hand. "I'm sorry for the lack of space here," he said awkwardly. The woman smiled warmly. "I'm Sophia Morgan, Mr. Saunders. And I'm not really a reporter. I'm an author, writing a book about new trends in banking. From what I've read, People's First Bank would make a wonderful case study." David was immediately intrigued and happy to talk with her. As their conversation flowed, David found himself increasingly impressed by Eva's intelligence and easy charm. She had earned her MBA from Harrington University and spent several years working with one of the major consulting firms before deciding to pursue her interest in writing. By the time their meeting ended, David realized they had been talking for hours. Eva smiled apologetically as she stood to leave. "I've kept you long enough," she said, "but I'd love to continue our conversation another time." David quickly agreed, and they set a date for their next meeting. At the next interview, over coffee, David opened up about his past, including his marriage to Lily and her tragic death. Eva listened sympathetically, tears welling up in her eyes. In turn, she shared her own story, including a difficult first marriage that had ended in abuse. "I never had my nose fixed," Eva said, touching the crooked bridge. "It reminds me of the cost of being too trusting." David told her he thought it made her look even more striking, and she smiled gratefully. After that, their meetings became more frequent, and soon, it was clear they were more than just author and subject. They were falling in love. 6 months later, David proposed to Eva, and she eagerly accepted. David offered her any kind of wedding she wanted, but Eva insisted on a simple ceremony at their home, with only a few close friends present. And that's exactly what they did. David's thoughts were interrupted by a burst of laughter from the audience as Lucas Edwards wrapped up his introduction. David glanced at Eva, who was smiling at him from her seat, and allowed himself a moment of intense satisfaction. Life was pretty damn good, he thought, after all he'd been through. The biggest problem he had now was deciding how to say no to the latest buyout offer from one of the big banks. "And now," Greg's voice rang out, "without further ado, I give you your Banker of the Year, John Mitchell." Applause swept through the room as David rose to take the stage. David leaned over and kissed Sophia Morgan before he rose to approach the podium. As he reached into his suit jacket to grab his notes, he was surprised to find that he was sweating profusely. "I'm not usually this nervous before making a speech," he thought to himself as he made his way toward the microphone. A wave of heat washed over him, and he glanced at the air vents in the ceiling, thinking, "I need to ask them to turn up the AC in here." He spread his notes out on the podium, looked around the room, and suddenly froze. His heart was pounding in his chest so loudly that he wondered if the audience could hear it. A strange, metallic taste filled his mouth, and an old line from an REM song popped into his head, "Aluminum tastes like fear." David turned to look at Greg for some kind of help, but when his gaze landed on his friend's face, he recoiled. Greg's face was highlighted by rainbow-like colors that made him look like a hallucination. David rubbed his eyes, but the colors only grew brighter, and soon, they began to pulse and shift unnaturally. As panic set in, he grabbed onto the podium for stability. The taste of chocolate suddenly mixed with the metallic taste in his mouth, making his stomach churn. He opened his mouth to ask for help, but his tongue and lips were moving in slow motion, making the sound that came out a garbled mess, like a distorted foghorn. The crowd stirred, and David could hear shouting from the back of the room. He tried to focus, but his view of the audience was now blurred and shifting. Faces seemed to stretch and warp in front of him, transforming into monstrous, unrecognizable shapes. Hands reached toward him, but they looked like the claws of zombies from some horror movie. David let out a high-pitched moan and stumbled back, trying to hide behind the podium, but even it seemed to quiver and pulse beneath his hands, like a living, breathing creature. As he stared down, horrified, the microphone suddenly transformed into a snake. Its mouth opened wide, revealing dripping fangs, and David shoved the thing away from him in terror. The podium crashed to the floor with a deafening thud, and the sound seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating in strange colors. Shouts and screams filled the room, but David's vision was now a mix of blurs, lights, and chaos. He looked up, and the walls of the ballroom appeared to be melting, dripping like wax before his eyes. Before he could process what was happening, a bright glint of light from the ceiling caught his attention. The crystal chandeliers above him had turned into icicles, sharp and deadly, and they began to hurtle toward him. In a blind panic, David threw himself over the table in front of him and rolled off the dais, hitting the floor with a thud. For a moment, he was stunned, but then shadowy shapes loomed over him, closing in quickly. He crawled under the table, seeking shelter in the darkness, hoping to escape the madness around him. The dimness brought a moment of calm, but then strange blobs of light appeared, twisting and contorting into grotesque forms. Some of them were oddly beautiful, and he paused, mesmerized by their shapes, until they started closing in on him again. Strong hands grabbed him, and despite his frantic struggles, David was dragged out from beneath the table. The weight of something heavy pressed down on his arms and legs, restraining him, and he could feel something clamping over his head, preventing him from thrashing. The noise around him grew louder and more intense. David screamed, trying to drown out the sounds with his own voice, but it was no use. There was additional pressure on his knee, and a sharp pain shot through his right thigh. His world began to dissolve into darkness. The last thing David saw before everything went black was Eva's face, blurry and distant, looming over him. And then, there was nothing. Thanks for watching the story of John Mitchell. What do you think happened at the ceremony? Medical, mental, or something else? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.